Hello students, welcome to today's basic science class. Today we'll be discussing food chain, food web, tropic level and pyramid of number and energy. Food chain, food web, tropic level, pyramid of number and pyramid of energy. Now what is food chain? Food chain is a linear feeding relationship. It is a linear feeding relationship among organisms in the same environment. So we can say food chain is a linear relationship, feeding relationship involving the transfer of energy from producers to the final consumer. I will repeat myself. Food chain is a linear feeding relationship among organisms in the same environment. It involves the transfer of energy from producer to consumer. So like I said, is a linear feeding relationship. Take for example, in an ecosystem. You know, in the last class where we discussed ecosystem, I told you that is a community of plants and animal functioning with the non-living in that environment. And then we are able to discuss the living factor in an ecosystem where I mentioned the producer, consumers, and the decomposer. If you can still remember, the producers. And I told you then that producers are plants, while the consumers are animals that depends directly or indirectly on plants. That is to tell you that plants produces their own food. Now in a food chain, you know, I said is a transfer of energy from producer to consumer, telling you that it involves plants and animal, which are the consumers. Now every food chain will start with plants, which are producers. Take for example, in a particular habitat, in a particular terrestrial habitat, we have the grasshopper, and the lizard. Now, the grass is the producer in this sense, and the grasshopper will feed on the grass, and lizard will also feed on the grasshopper. So the process is a linear process. So energy is being transferred from the producer, which is the grass, down to the grasshopper, and energy is being transferred from grasshopper down to lizard. So it's a linear feeding relationship. Take for example, now this is an example of a food chain. Now if you look at this first food chain, my first example here, we have the guinea grass, followed by the grasshopper, then we have the toad, and lastly there we have the snake. Now the producer is the guinea grass. The consumers are, we have the grasshopper, toad, and snake. They are all consumers. Then we have the producer, which is the guinea grass. Now here you see that the first consumer, the first organism feeding on the producer is called the primary consumer. Now the second one feeding on the primary consumer is called the secondary consumer. And the third one feeding on the secondary consumer is called tertiary consumer. So every other organism from here, now if we now have for example, let's say we have men feeding on snake now, they are all tertiary consumers. So here in a food chain starts with primary, with producers, which are always plants. So the energy is being transferred from the producer to the final consumer, which is the snake here in my example. So there is going in each of these stages there is transfer of energy. That is food chain. So that's why I define food chain as a feeding relationship involving the transfer of energy from producer to consumer, and it's always a linear feeding relationship. Now if you look at the second example, you will see that we have grass, antelope and lion. Grass, antelope feeds on grass and lion feeds on antelope. So there's a transfer of energy from grass to antelope and finally to lion. So that is that on food chain. Now the second one is food web. Food web is a complex feeding relationship among organisms in the same environment with two or more interrelated food chain. It is a complex feeding relationship among the organism in an environment with one or more interrelated food chain. Now, telling you that food web has more than one food chain. That is, in a food web have more than only one food chain. A food web might be having 2 food chains, 3 food chains, 4 food chains, and so on and so forth, depending on the number of organisms in that environment, and not only that, depending on the relationship between their feeding ability or between their feeding in such an environment. So a food chain may have only a food web might have only 2 food chains, 3 food chains, and so on and so forth. Now, looking at this food web, this is an example of food web. This is a food web in an aquatic habitat. You all know that we have terrestrial and aquatic habitat. Now this is an example of a food web in an aquatic habitat. From here we have aquatic plants, we have crayfish, we have fish, we have frog, insects. Now looking at this now, there's another one here. We have from aquatic plant to toad to fish. Now if we are to count the food chain in this food web, let's do it together. We have the aquatic plant feeds on crayfish feeds on aquatic plants, and fish feeds on crayfish. Now looking at this again, you see that here you have aquatic plants, which tadpole feeds on aquatic plants and fish on fish. So you can see that in this food web now we have more than one food chain. So there the organisms, they interact, and this brings relationship between their feeding. You see that in a food web, a single organism might be like that plant, other organism might be feeding on that aquatic plant, and there are alternatives in a food web. If an organism is not feeding on one, it will be feeding on another. So there are, if in a food web, there is options for the organism in such an environment. Now looking at this is also an example of a food web in a terrestrial habitat. Let's start from the producer. We have the grass, grasshopper, toad, snake, hog, man. Now again, grass, mouse, feed mouse, snake. That is another food chain. Now we have it again, grass, goat, lion, man. That is another food chain. So, like I said earlier, in a food web, it has more than one food chain. depending on the number of organisms in such an environment, and also depending on how their feeding is interrelated. So that is that on food web. Now we have tropic level. Tropic level is each levels in a food chain or a food web. Each levels we have in a food chain or a food web. That is a tropic level. Now, looking at this food chain, this is a food chain. We have guinea grass, we have grasshopper, we have toad. This is a food chain. Now, each levels in a food chain is called the tropic level. Now, looking at it, in each level, like I said earlier, energy is transferred. Now, so looking at this now, we have the first tropic level. The first tropic level starts from the producer. So the producer is what? The first tropic level. Now, we move to the primary consumer, which is the second tropic level. Then the third tropic level is the toad, which is the secondary consumer. So like that. So if we have more than, like we have 5 organisms, 6 organisms, so also the tropic level. If we have 5 organisms that is in a particular food chain, you know quite alright that the levels in such a food chain will be 5 tropic level. So it starts from the producer down to the final consumer. So in this food chain, we have 3 tropic levels. Now, like the other one I gave you earlier. Now, in this food chain also, from grass to grasshopper to toad, from grass. Look at the first example. From grass to grasshopper to toad and snake. Now, if you now want to look at it, you see that from this guinea grass, that is our first tropic level, down to grasshopper, which is the second tropic level, then toad is the third tropic level, and the fourth one is that of the snake. So we have 4 tropic level in this first example of the food chain that is here. So it is each level that is present in a food chain or food web. That is our tropic level. Now we have the pyramid of number and energy. Now, what is pyramid of number? Pyramid of number is just the decrease, is representing the decrease in the number of organisms from the producer to the final consumer. That is, there is always decrease in the number of organisms involving from the producer to the final consumer. Now, let's take our feed, the school feed, as an example. On the school feed, we have grasses, we have grasshopper, let's say we have snake on the school feed. Now, looking at it, the number of grasses is more than the number of grasshopper. Now, the number of grasshopper there is more than the number of lizard, telling you that from producer to consumer to the final consumer, there is always a decrease in the number of organisms. Let's say we have like 40 grasses. Now, and you know quite alright that the number of grasshopper that will feed on grass will not be more than the grass. I mean more than the grasses. So there is always a decrease in the number of the organism from the producer to the final consumer. So I can say the pyramid of number is just the presentation, or let's say is representing the decrease in the number of organisms from producer to the final consumers. Now, pyramid of energy is just also the representation of the decrease in the number in energy from the producer to the final consumer. So there is also a decrease in the energy transferred from the producer to the final consumer. There is always a decrease in the energy from producer to the final consumer. Let's say from producer have 100 joules of energy. Now the consumer definitely there will be decrease, because the energy cannot be transferred 100% to the produce and to the consumers. So the energy from the producer cannot be transferred 100% to the consumer. And when it's being transferred from the primary consumer to the secondary consumer, it cannot be 100%. It shows that there is going to be a reduction in the energy. So the representation of the decrease in this energy from the producer to consumer is pyramid of energy. So that is that about the food chain, food web, tropic level, pyramid of number, and pyramid of energy. I think with the little explanation I am able to make, you'll be able to understand the topic very well. Thank you. Stay blessed till we meet next class. God bless you.